The Shadow of Morgan, a tale of darkness and vengeance. It all began in the dark of night, when shadows thickened and the streets were empty. In the depths of the gloomy city, where the light of lanterns barely penetrated the darkness, lived a girl named Emily. Her days were woven with monotony and melancholy until that night, which forever changed her life. She was an ordinary girl who lived with her parents in a quiet neighborhood of the city. But one day, when night enveloped the streets with its darkness, Emily did not return home after her walk. Her parents panicked, and an investigation began. Hundreds of people joined the search for the missing girl. The police reviewed surveillance footage, combed every corner of the city, but not a single trace of Emily was found. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but the missing girl remained invisible, as if swallowed by the darkness itself. Soon after Emily's disappearance, the city was gripped with horror. Other children began to vanish, and it soon became evident that a serial killer was at large. The investigation dragged on for months, and the city lived in constant fear and uncertainty. The police sifted through every clue, and the evidence pointed to someone within the police force, but no one could have imagined that it was none other than Jacob Morgan. Jacob Morgan was a detective, highly skilled and determined. His fiery spark was a bright light in the darkness of this investigation. Jacob was determined, with a sense of humor and the ability to solve even the most complex puzzles. In the eyes of society, he was a hero, one who stood against darkness and evil. But what no one suspected was that Jacob harbored dark secrets within his soul. While everyone around was engaged in investigation and searches, the maniac continued his crimes. All evidence pointed to him being the one who kidnapped children and enveloped the city in fear. His motives were dark and unfathomable. He spoke of his childhood filled with fear and loneliness, and that he wished to share these feelings with the whole world. But no one could understand how he could commit such terrible acts. Jacob was arrested and convicted of his crimes. His name became a symbol of betrayal and darkness that could hide in the most unexpected place. But the city, despite the shock and fear, was able to recover after this tragedy. Emily was found alive and unharmed thanks to the efforts of the police and society. She became a symbol of hope and revival for the city, which survived dark times. But even after the end of this story, the shadow of Jacob Morgan remained hanging in the air, reminding everyone that evil can hide anywhere, even among those we trust the most. Second part. After Jacob Morgan's arrest, the city remained gripped with shock and disbelief. How could such a respected law enforcer turn out to be a serial killer, terrorizing the city with fear and horror? The investigation surrounding Jacob uncovered new details of his atrocities. It turned out that he not only abducted children and tormented them, but also conducted mysterious rituals, the purpose of which remained a mystery to the police. Gradually, it became clear that each abduction was part of a rather complex scheme. Jacob used his police privileges and access to information to monitor potential victims, avoiding suspicion. His actions were well planned and left minimal traces. But despite his cunning, Jacob was ultimately caught, thanks to the persistence and determination of the police, who refused to believe that evil could hide among their own ranks. The children and their parents freed from Jacob's captivity felt a mixture of relief and bitterness. They had all lived through a nightmare that left deep scars on their souls. But now, with evil defeated, they could begin to heal and rebuild their lives. However, even after Jacob Morgan's arrest, the shadow of his crimes continued to hang over the city. People became more cautious, more suspicious. They began to see evil in the most innocent actions. It was a time when trust was shattered and fear once again settled in the hearts of the residents. But amid the darkness, there is always light, and the city did not succumb to the threat. Slowly but surely, life returned to its normal rhythms, and people learned to trust each other again. Emily, freed from the clutches of the maniac, became a symbol of hope and strength for all the city's residents. Her story inspired people not to lose heart in the face of evil, but to fight for their beliefs and their safety. Thus ended the story of how a serial killer, hiding behind the mask of a respected police officer, was finally exposed and captured. But the traces of his atrocities remained forever, reminding us that even the most unexpected threats can lurk right before our eyes. Third part. The investigation against Jacob Morgan was complex and lengthy. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, and many thought this was the end of his story. But as it turned out, it was only the beginning of a new, even darker chapter. As time passed, Jacob became more and more withdrawn. His soul was filled with rage and hatred towards the world he believed had betrayed him. In his eyes, the world was full of lies and hypocrisy, and he was determined to return and show everyone who he truly was. One night, when darkness shrouded the prison walls, Jacob decided to act. He found a weak spot in the security, using his knowledge of the system acquired as a police officer. With cunning and cold-bloodedness, he escaped from prison, leaving behind only a chilling message promising revenge to all who dared to stand in his way. As news of Jacob Morgan's escape spread, the city was once again engulfed in panic and fear. Everyone who had any connection to his arrest and conviction knew they could become his next targets. He was free, and his thirst for vengeance was unstoppable. Police officers who had been involved in his arrest were particularly at risk. Jacob was determined to find them all and end them once and for all. His mind was sharp, his plans well thought out, and no one could predict where he would strike next. Some of the police officers, realizing the danger, began to go underground, trying to hide from Jacob's vengeful wrath. Others remained, determined to defend the city and its residents at any cost. Photos of Jacob Morgan were posted all over the city, announcing his escape and warning everyone to beware of him. But the maniac was cunning and skilled, and his trail was difficult to track. He lurked in the shadows, patiently waiting for his moment to strike. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, but Jacob remained elusive. He continued his hunt for his former pursuers, as well as anyone who dared to thwart his plans. With each new crime, his name became more legendary, and his crimes more cruel and merciless. The city was plunged into a state of constant fear and apprehension. People barricaded themselves in their homes, avoiding eye contact on the streets, fearing that anyone could be Jacob Morgan's next victim. But even in the darkest night, there is hope for a brighter morning. The police and the entire community were determined to catch Jacob and bring him to justice. And though he was cunning and dangerous, they were resolute and ready to confront him to the end. The fate of Jacob Morgan and all those who crossed his path hung in the balance. The question of who would emerge victorious in this showdown remained unanswered. But one thing was clear: the end of this story was far from near, and it promised to be bloody and unpredictable. Fourth part. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but Jacob Morgan could not evade justice. Every move of his was carefully calculated. Every attempt to hide was deciphered. Finally, his trail led the police to an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city, where he committed another horrific crime. Police surrounded the building, giving Jacob no chance of escape. During the confrontation with the police, he was captured, unable to resist the forces of law that had finally caught up with him. His arrest was a triumph for the entire city, a symbol that even the most cunning and dangerous criminals cannot escape justice. Brought to trial, Jacob Morgan was found guilty of a series of horrific crimes that shook the entire city. His lawyers tried to defend him, but the evidence was too compelling and the crimes too brutal. The trial was short and merciless. The verdict was pronounced death penalty. For many, it was a lawful and rightful outcome, but for others, it was evidence that even in the darkest corners of a person's soul, there remains a place for mercy and forgiveness. On the eve of his execution, Jacob Morgan was transferred to the death row cell. He spent his final hours in solitude, immersed in reflections on his life and his actions. There was no fear or remorse in his eyes, only bitter sadness and hatred towards the world that, as he believed, had betrayed him. And finally, the day arrived. Jacob Morgan was led to the execution chamber, where lethal injection awaited him. The doomed criminal's last words were only a measured whisper, lost in the noise of the crowd. The execution of Jacob Morgan was not only the end of his life, but also the conclusion of a dark chapter in the city's history. The city's residents were finally able to survive the horror that hung over them and begin to rebuild their lives and their hopes. But the shadow of Jacob Morgan will remain hanging over the city, reminding us that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places, and that each of us must remain vigilant and determined in the fight against it.